Hi, I'm Michael Manning from American Autowire, and today we're going to discuss the original and the new ignition switch in the 1955-56 Chevy Classic Update Series kit. What we're going to do is clarify the operation of the ignition, an original 1955-56 ignition switch, and the ignition switch that we supply as a replacement in the Classic Update Series kit for the 55-6 Chevy. A few little facts about the switch itself. Basically, the switches operate the same way, but there's differences in the bodies of the switch. The original 1955 switch has a threaded area, it has landings, and it's got a notch in it right here. Now, what we've got over here is a little kind of an example of what your dash would look like. Your dash itself has a notch in it. That notch is going to match the notch in the ignition switch. The new switch has a deeper body, so it's more of a universal switch, but because of that, it doesn't have the landings that the original one did to locate the retaining ring. What it does have is a slider nut behind it that you need to adjust for the depth in the dash. The switch itself has a flat right here. So instead of a notch, it's got a flat area. It's about 3 or 4 times as wide. When you use that flat with the notch in the dash, that switch has the ability to move. You can see I'm twisting it a little. So it moves. That's going to come into play when we put the bezel on and you see how to adjust the functions of the switch. So just understand that that's built in. It's supposed to be that way. All right, so the next thing we're going to do is, again, we'll put the bezel on. And the bezel has a notch that mates to that flat, and the bezel has, you can see the movement there. So you got a lot of movement between the bezel, the switch, and the indexing slot. You still have it that ultimately you won't be able to turn the ignition switch, but it does have some travel. Okay, what we're going to do now is put a retainer and the retaining nut on, and we'll screw that down. The next thing you're going to do is you're going to put the lock cylinder back into this kit, now into this switch. When you put the lock cylinder in again, we have that pin area that's kind of half-shaped. It's going to fit into a slot in the base of the switch. Now you'll see how easy it slides in. Okay, right now you're in the slot. When you push it, you'll feel the spring tension. Turn it to the right, now you're locked in. Okay, same way. Functionally, it's the same thing in both cases. Now let's talk about the detent positions. Okay, I can remove the key in the unlock position. The next position over is the off position. Okay? Well, what I can do now is I can move the switch and I can move the bezel so that my off position lines up. Once that lines up, then I can tighten my nut real good. So when you first put it in, leave the nut a little loose. This way it'll allow you to move so you can do the alignment. And what you're doing is you're moving against that flat part that was on the ignition switch. Remember how wide we said it had about a 10-degree movement? That allows me to have this adjustment. The off position, the next position is my on position. You can see it's there. And I go to start position, spring back off to the on position, to the off position. In the off and on position, I can remove the key like I can do in the original, and I will still be able to operate the vehicle in on and the start position to the off position, but I will not be able to lock it. The key must be in to go to the lock position, and now, because of the function of the switch, I need it to go to the accessory position. I need the key in for that also, and there is the accessory position over here, not on the bezel. So what we're going to do now is I need to take the cylinder back out. Don't forget, the furthest left position is where I need to be to take that cylinder out. Now, in the case of the new switch, it's going to be in the accessory position. Again, push my tool against the spring, a little turn to the left, boom, pops right on out. I'm going to take that bezel off real quick and show you that we simulated what we have here, and you can see that we go from start on off lock accessory. Nobody's making this bezel right now, but you need to understand that that is a true accessory position. Okay, now we're going to talk about the hookups on the back of the ignition switch and what the differences are in function of the switch based upon where the key cylinder is. Let's talk about the new ignition switch. What do we do in that case when we're dealing with a starter that has an R terminal on it? Then you're going to run it the way typically you would normally do it, and that's to run a wire from the R terminal directly to the positive side of the coil that bypasses the ballast resistor. Pretty easy. Reason is, on this switch, when the key's in the run position, you have battery power to ignition 1 and the accessory. When you're in the start position, you have power to ignition 1 and the solenoid. So that's basically what's saying is that with this switch, whether you're in run or crank, the ignition 1 lead is always live. This is what you need if you're going to run a fuel injection car or you're going to run a 12-volt system that needs a constant 12 volts to the distributor. Okay? Now, it's nice in that this system is live that way that you really don't need to run this 12-volt override. The only time you need that is when you're dealing with a points car, because you have to introduce the ballast resistor in this ignition 1 line to the distributor. So now you're relegated to running the R wire from the starter solenoid to the other side of the coil, and that's to bypass the ballast resistor in the start cycle. Okay, well, obviously with this switch, when you turn it to the accessory position, you only get what's connected to the accessory terminal. So this is truly like most later models that maybe just run your radio or something on the accessory lead, as opposed to an original switch or any switch that runs like a heater or an AC or anything else on the ignition 1. They would be live in the case of the original. They're not live in the case of this new switch, because you would be segregated only to what's on the accessory circuit. Now, one other situation happens, and if you're using the new ignition switch and you're using a system where you're attempting to run a point distributor and you have a starter solenoid that does not have an R terminal on it. This would be very common with a high torque starter, or any aftermarket, or even some of the GM starters now that do not have that extra terminal on it. Now you need a 12-volt override. There is no way to do it with this switch, so you have to run what's called a starter bypass diode. And you do that by running a special kit. It's a 500997, and what it does essentially is it picks up a signal from the solenoid lead and feeds 12 volts to the coil, bypassing the ballast resistor, but it's got an internal diode which prevents any backfeed. And that's a unique situation. That would be the new ignition switch with a point type distributor and a starter solenoid that does not have an R terminal on it. Otherwise, this output on this ignition 1 terminal, and the way we build the Classic Update kit, is pure 12 volts coming off the ignition switch, as if we were running HEI or a system that needed a constant 12 volts. Okay, we do not build that with a ballast resistor in it or a resistor wire to knock down the voltage for a point distributor. So if you are using the kit with fuel injection or HEI, just hook up ignition 1 right to the distributor. You're good to go, no problem. If you are using a point system, then you have to use one of the ways that we've explained, and how to hook that switch up so that you can bypass the ballast resistor on a 12-volt override in the start cycle. The original 1955 switch has a threaded area, it has landings, and it's got a notch in it right here. Now, what we've got over here is a little kind of an example of what your dash would look like. Your dash itself has a notch in it. That notch is going to match the notch in the ignition switch. What that does is provides a location not only for the original light, but also for the bezel ring and for the operation of the key cylinder. So if you see now, you can see this slot here. It fits in that little slot right there. That's how it's going to fit in your original dash. Okay? That's how it looks from behind. The light is on top. First thing is the original switch has a light in it. The replacement switch does not have a light. If you go back to what we talked about originally, there is a slot in the switch, and the body is pretty much set at this distance. You see these stops on the switch and this slot. That's all relevant to the dash. If you look at the original dash, there's an alignment pin in the dash that matches that slot, and of course these standoffs will allow the switch only to go so deep into the cavity in the dash. So we'll kind of do that right now. We'll align those up, we'll put that in, you can see, bing, lines in. There's the slot, there's the pin. We're going to line them up and it slides right in. Okay? Now, this is how it's going to look inside your dash. And if you take a look right here, I can't move that switch all that much. I got a little movement, but I can't move it that much because it's pretty much set by the pin, the alignment, and the standoffs. So now I'll take an original bezel. The original bezel has a notch in it. That notch matches the notch in the switch. So that sets the bezel now in, and you can see that I'm trying to move it, and there's not much movement in that either. Okay? So now I have a retaining nut that fits on top of that, and if I screw that down, just give me a minute to screw that in. That's how the system looks, and you really can't move that switch too much. And you don't want to, because that functionally is how the original switch worked. On the original 55-56 switch, there was a unique situation in that there were ignition 1, ignition 2 terminals, which you can see here, battery, accessory, and solenoid. Obviously the hookups to the battery are the battery lead, and the solenoid is activated when you turn the key to the start position. But it's interesting to find out what else is going on. When you turn on the start position, or you put it in the run position, you have power on the ignition 1 and the accessory lead, even though the switch does not have a true accessory position. So technically, the accessory and ignition are basically nothing more than bus to the battery when the ignition's in the on position. So it is not a true accessory position, it's just the way the switch is labeled. When you're in the start position, not only do you have power from battery to solenoid, but you have power to the ignition 2 terminal, okay? Now, why? That's the million-dollar question. When you are dealing with an original points car, in the original 55-6 Chevy, they did not have an R terminal on the starter solenoid. And if you look at your typical starter solenoid, you'll have two terminals. You have an S terminal for starter, or the solenoid lead, and you have an R terminal, which is a resistor lead. What that terminal did was give you a 12-volt override that fed a points car system to start the car. When the car started, this wire would not be live anymore. You would flip back the ignition switch. You would be driving on ignition 1, and that went through a ballast resistor and reduced the volts down so you didn't burn your points out. Okay, so now what we have is customers who are, in some cases, wanting to use the original ignition switch, but yet they have differences in the starter for a point system. They're either going to have a starter that has an R terminal on it, or they're not. Either case, the original system will work. Now, we just explained to you what happens in the case of the starter that doesn't have an R terminal on it. What if your starter does? Then optionally, you really have two ways of doing it. You can do it the original way that the switch was designed, in that you feed the coil, the distributor part, on the other side of the ballast resistor directly from ignition 2. That's a 12-volt override, and that's the way that the switch is designed. When you're, again, as I said, when you're not on the starter circuit anymore, then you have power between battery and ignition 1, and you would run through a ballast resistor through your coil to your distributor. So it's real easy. If you had an original ignition switch, you could work with the starter that had an R terminal or those that did not. In the case of that you're running an HEI distributor where you need a 12-volt feed, then the original switch becomes a bit of an issue. What we do in the kit and what you normally do is you jump ignition 1 and 2 together, and that solves the problem because there's always a 12-volt feed. There's no need to have a reduced feed to the coil.